Ron Gilbert, the co-creator of Maniac Mansion and the first two Monkey Island titles, has, as you might imagine, a pretty strong sense for what makes an adventure game, although his definition may not be exactly what you'd expect.
I mean, to me, an adventure game isn't about going on an adventure. I mean, sometimes adventure games are really not about going on an adventure, but it's about that puzzle solving. It's about kind of intellectually working your way through.
In his mind, it's the puzzles that define this genre, and it's not difficult to see how that thought process has shaped his work over the last 30 years. In fact, there's one very specific example of this that I'd like to look at today. It's found in The Secret of Monkey Island and is, of course, the insult-based sword fighting. Now, Gilbert, right from the start, was adamant that Monkey Island didn't need to feature traditional action sequences. This would be a game about thinking and problem solving, so throwing the player into a situation where they need to quickly hammer their keyboard to win a sword fight just didn't really sit very well. Or to use more modern terminology, he didn't want his game to include QuickTime events. Initially, the team played around with a different concept in which the player selected an action from a list of sword fighting verbs like parry and lunge, which they'd use depending on the actions of their opponents, but it never felt right. It didn't make for a very good puzzle, and importantly, it wouldn't make people laugh. Eventually, the idea for replacing this list of techniques with a list of insults instead came from people at Lucasfilm Games, as it was then called, watching a whole bunch of pirate and swashbuckling movies in search of inspiration. I asked Gilbert about this, and he told me there was Errol Flynn's work in the 30s and 40s that inspired them the most, although he did give a shout out to The Princess Bride, glad to hear that. The characters in these films, he explained, spent a lot of time talking to each other, throwing shade and generally just egging each other on during combat.
Wait! You'll not take her while I live! Then I'll take her when you're dead!
Insults and comebacks then seemed to be the answer. There was potential here for puzzle solving, lots of humour, and it wouldn't need to rely on reaction speed. But who would write this stuff? Given the rest of the game is written by Ron Gilbert, Tim Schafer, and Dave Grossman, you may have assumed it was one of them, but in fact, these lines ended up being penned by a famous sci-fi novelist who just happened to be visiting the studio. Lucasfilm Games at this point was based out of Skywalker Ranch, and so from time to time the team would just rub shoulders with some pretty big names. Gilbert tells stories of meeting a lost Jack Nicholson as he stumbled into their office, or genuinely Steven Spielberg calling the team when he got stuck playing an adventure game. That one is nuts. And so it was one day mid-development Orson Scott Card, as in the author of Ender's Game, was invited to the ranch to take a look at some of the games being worked on. During that visit, he was so impressed by The Secret of Monkey Island, he offered to write the insults for the game's new sword fighting mechanic with some help from his kids, and that should be a fantastic anecdote, particularly the thought that his children gave him a hand with all these daft comebacks, likely drawing on their experiences from the school playground or whatever. That's a really lovely image. But unfortunately, several months before the release of the game, Card also wrote an essay entitled The Hypocrites of Homosexuality, in which he argued in favour of laws prohibiting homosexuality, and so I find it kind of difficult to talk about his input here with all that much affection. Back to sword fighting. Right, here's how it works in The Secret of Monkey Island. As Guybrush completes his initial training, the player is taught two sets of insults and comebacks, the first being probably the most famous of the lot.
You fight like a dairy farmer. How appropriate. You fight like a cow. You see?
And the idea from this point onwards is that once a duel gets underway, the player or their opponent will begin with an insult, and then the other party attempts to counter it using a comeback. Should they select the correct one, they'll force their opponent back a few steps, but if they use the wrong one, they themselves get pushed back instead. It's a fairly straightforward setup. However, as you'll start with just 2 insults and 2 comebacks, out of a possible 16 of each, there's no way you can actually win a sword fight just yet. This means every time you get into a duel and your opponent uses an insult you haven't heard before, which is most of them at this point, you'll have no way to counter it. You just have to take the hit. But very importantly, Guybrush will now remember that line for all future fights. If you use it enough yourself, you'll eventually meet a pirate who does know the correct comeback, and yes, you'll take another hit, but you now have access to that line as well. Although Guybrush will learn these insults and comebacks automatically, the actual process of selecting them during a fight isn't automatic. The team didn't want it to be. Instead, when you're the recipient of an insult, you'll have to scroll through every single comeback that you've collected so far to find a response. And sure, you may have written them down in pairs, or more recently just checked a guide online, I guess, but the hope was that occasionally you'd need to rely on logic. Take a moment and figure out which response makes the most sense, which is funniest. And even if you have a fantastic memory, there's still a moment where you're forced into thinking like this. During your final duel with Carla, the swordmaster of Melee Island, she uses an entirely different set of insults to the pirates you've met before now, but you're still equipped with the same list of comebacks, which means you have to read what she says, think about it, and then figure out which comeback still makes sense given the context. It's such a great idea. You have this set of punchlines that you've been relying on up until now that always work, and suddenly the jokes themselves are completely different. And that's why Insult Sword Fighting works so nicely, I think. Ron Gilbert and the team ensured that it felt like a puzzle and not a quick-time event. It certainly fits thematically, and yet perhaps even more than both of those things, it also encourages us, the players, to be funny. The secret of Monkey Island is almost always trying to make us laugh and almost always succeeding with that goal, and yet here, very briefly, we're allowed to help out with the jokes. And I think that is an exceptionally cool idea. But hey, what do I know? Maybe adventure games aren't even about going on adventures. All right, cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Here's a Thing. If you'd like to check out some of the others that we've done here the last couple of weeks, we've got How Valve Found Portal, which is cool. It was at a careers fair, spoiler. And we've also got one about the Fallout sex formula, which has got sex in the title, so you'll probably click that one instead. And yeah, if not, hope you like this. Please do give it a like on YouTube if that's where you are, and we will see you next Thursday. Goodbye.